My name is Mark Vernon, and I am delighted today to be joined by Jason Baxter. Hi there, Jason.
Hi.
Hey, Jason, I reached out to you because you've written this fantastic book about C.S. Lewis, the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, how great books shaped a great mind. And I was asked to review it for a publication in the UK. And to be honest with you, I picked it up and started reading thinking I'll enjoy this because it's the medieval side of Lewis that I enjoy the most. But the book really quite took me by surprise because I felt quite a subversive Lewis was coming out in what you've written. I mean, I'm one of these people engaged with the Inklings who tends to lean more towards Tolkien. My actual real interest in the bunch is Owen Barfield. I wrote this book about Owen Barfield. And C.S. Lewis, is therefore of great interest, but I'm inclined to see him through the filter of modern rational apologetics for Christianity, and find the Narnia stories engaging, but not completely gripping. But your book has made me look at Lewis again. So I just wonder, whose Lewis is your Lewis, and what got you into this side of him? Because as you say, he was at home in the medieval age. That really was where he found the air that he could breathe and feel nourished by.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm deeply grateful for those kind words. I think that this Lewis is the Lewis who was writing his friend and saying, I don't remember the Phaedrus perfectly, but what I do remember of it is that wonderful myth of the charioteer and how our souls, before they were incarnate in our bodies, would gather in the wake of the gods and travel up to this place which Plato calls the hyper-Uranian plane, whatever that is. And at the apex of the universe, they would look and they would see. And depending on how good of a glimpse they got and how much it warmed their souls is how much they remembered of it until they fell back into their bodies. This is what Lewis writes Arthur Greeley and say that he remembers about the Phaedrus. This is the sort of Lewis that I'm talking about, in which the Lewis who essentially conflates 2,000 years of Platonizing mysticism and the Middle Ages. What the term I just reach for in the book is the long Middle Ages, and reads the world iconically, reads the cosmos symbolically, but is sort of deeply informed by Platonism and that kind of Platonic approach to the world, amplified with influences from Boethius and Dante, and a little bit of romanticism, right, sprinkled on for seasoning, is to my surprise consistent through Lewis. And there's this incredible passage in Lewis's Discarded Image where he talks about this wonderful history of what the French philosopher Pierre Hadot called the view from above, in which, beginning with Cicero, but then repeated in Boethius, repeated in Dante, repeated in Boccaccio, repeated in Chaucer, right? The soul goes up to the apex of the world, turns around, looks down, sees the earth, 100,000 miles below, and smiles to see the things that made us so nervous and anxious in our life. Now, from this perspective, they just seem small and tenebrous and pale. Lewis loved this, and he had his finger on the pulse of this. Well, keeping that in mind, and keeping that in mind that this is what Boethius means by something like what Boethius means by an encounter with eternity, gives, I think, a sort of key to find how many times this actually breaks out into Lewis's writings, whether it's his apologetics, whether it's his Surprised by Joy, in which this Boethian eternity reappears now under the guise of joy. But there's this sort of deep Platonic wellspring in both the apologetics and in Lewis's fiction, which once I had eyes to see it, I was dazzled and surprised to see that Lewis was successful as a writer of apologetics and children's literature, not despite his day job as a medievalist, but because of it.
Now, look, there's so much already in what you said, which is tremendous and wonderful. But I wanted to stress that this idea of Christian Platonism and C.S. Lewis is deeply controversial in many circles these days. And there's kind of the popular Christian apologists who often draw on Lewis might also work quite hard to separate themselves from Platonism. They want a kind of Christianity that is much more sui generis than that. And So I wanted, is that's something you're recognizing? You're nodding there, but maybe also it's worth saying, what is the distinctiveness of this Platonism? I mean, and maybe just for my sort of two penneth, it's about a kind of Christianity which is just much more about a recollection, a remembering, a seeing, a perceiving, as you're saying there with this anagogic view, rather than say a Christianity that's much more focused, say, on sin and redemption and the uniqueness of Christ. For the Platonic take, Christ sort of gathers and manifests and fulfills all that had been bubbling away in the centuries before Christ in the Jewish world too, no doubt about that, but the Hellenistic milieu, really, which was this mix of Greek and Judaism before Christ was born, in the 2-3 centuries before he was born. And so, kind of seeing creation as the mirror of eternity, and so that we can live in the world but not of the world, because we too are in these multiple realms, if you like, and that kind of mystical approach to Christianity. I'm so excited to hear you talk so explicitly about why that's important for Lewis, because it feels really necessary to say today to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's what you're talking about in your book, The Secret History of Christianity, the sort of sad, emaciated conditions of Christianity, in which Christians are finding it difficult to make what we say we believe appealing. I mean, I oftentimes say to my students that and borrowing from Rudolf Otto, this wonderful term, which I discuss in my book, and I know you are deeply familiar with it, but the idea of the numinous, right? The idea of sort of a category of holiness, which is beyond my mere ability to live according to a moral code. I think in all kinds of interesting ways, which I'm sure we could discuss, but sort of somehow, some way, in becoming modern, we think about Christianity as possessing correct opinions and living according to a correct code, as if Christianity were nothing more than a code of behavior. It's what, some theologians jokingly say, living your whole life in the indicative and imperative mood, right? Whereas Christianity has this other, I'm thinking of David Ford right now, the Cambridge theologian, right? The future of Christianity, or the future of Christendom. Right, whereas Christianity traditionally has these strange passages, right? We have Job, and we have Jonah, and we have the Psalms. We have these sort of sense of longing, that the sort of breaking out into what David Ford, the metaphor he uses is the subjunctive mood, right? These sort of conditions of longing. So I think, I think absolutely. I think to kind of rescue Christianity from an affair of being a head religion, men without chest, Lewis calls it, a head religion in which I demand of myself a certain type of Kantian or Stoical behavior. Lewis goes after both the Stoics and Kant at the beginning of Weight of Glory, as your listeners will remember. And that opening it back up, and just Lewis calls it the spell of evil enchantment, again in Weight of Glory. That is, since when did we come to the conclusion that what we can sense, taste, and algorithmically reason about exhaust the totality of reality? Just by simply comparing us to our ancestors, we're a very strange data point in the grand history of Christianity, right? To think that because our senses, what our senses can perceive and are in contact with, exhaust the totality of reality. Why would reality be made exclusively to present itself, to the human intellect? It would be like denying that there are other forms of electromagnetic radiation outside of the visible spectrum, right? That we know that there are these other things. And I think Lewis is, with the tradition, is deeply interested in what we could metaphorically call these domains of reality outside of the mere visible spectrum. And yeah, I mean, I think all kinds of really interesting ways to to get at that. Like we could talk Boethius and the sort of hierarchies of the sort of powers of the soul. But I think this is the thing, and I think Lewis is really smart. He doesn't want to weird people out. He knows, and this is the crazy thing, right? He knows that if you just read a passage from an old Christian, you can make some modern Christians feel that you're reading a passage from a new age pantheist. But I think that's in some sense the conditions of our modernity, in which part of the excitement of being a modern Christian is to rummage around into the basement of Christianity and try to discover these strange and bizarre objects. I mean, we see this on the visual level, don't we? Right? I mean, some of these, gold gem encrusted gospel books, right? We just realized they felt completely differently about the word, about the cross, about this religion than we do. We can just see that on the very visible, but also on the level of ideas. There are some things which are just so encrusted with these precious and bizarre objects that I think as modern Christians, I think we have to have a modicum of humility and at least listen to them patiently, at least until we can sympathize and understand with how they're approaching the reality. And then we can begin to do what Lewis talks about in Learning in Wartime, right? To check those blind spots just out of the periphery of my vision. I think Lewis is so great about that, and he does it in such a gentle way. But this is a book I think is sort of, and I know your books too, Mark, are sort of responding to those invitations to see how weird our ancient forms of Christianity are, and if, in fact, that's the standard from which that we ourselves as modern Christians have deviated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really crucial, actually, because as you put it, the kind of credal and moral forms of Christianity, well, they don't do it for me, and it feels like they don't do it for a lot of people. Although Christianity is that funny thing that you can both talk about its decline, and yet it's still easily the biggest religion in the world and growing in so many places. So it's always complicated to talk about Christianities, but nonetheless, this perhaps sort of more hidden imperative in Lewis, which is to re-engage with the weird side of Christianity. The side that that makes comments that you're not supposed to understand in a rational way, which are supposed to, I think, help you make these leaps up the hierarchy of consciousness or being, and so appreciate seeing the same worlds but in a completely different way. It's not just about ameliorative improvements in your life, or even about some kind of consolation or guarantee in life. It's about the kingdom on earth now, kingdom of heaven now, and he's fostering, but quite subtly, these shifts of perception. And I mean, I do wonder whether, well, two things. Do you think now we need these shifts of perception that he was onto more than the more conventional apologetic Lewis? But to bring in sort of my man, if you like, Owen Barfield, who I think between the two of them, they did say if C.S. Lewis's time was sort of now, Barfield's would be 40 or 50 years hence, which is kind of about 2025 or something like that.
Yeah, well, you're there. You'll be there and waiting for everyone.
Well, I'm hoping, of course, but I don't know if it's true. But you see, because Barfield is much keener on the more sort of radical, esoteric, telling a deep history of the human mind that is not so easy to understand. But whether now is the moment to try and get this across more, because people, a friend of mine the other day said that the trouble with Christianity is that we've all received a kind of low dose vaccine of Christianity, and the upshot is that we're a bit immune to it now. We don't feel its full strength, and so your book, I think, is trying to, I don't know whether you felt explicitly, but is trying to say we got to read Lewis again. But do you think something about the Lewis Barfield kind of conjunction is part of that more, I don't know if the word's radical or certainly strange Christianity that might actually, make us jolt? It's the Christianity of the parables that aren't moral tales. Most of them completely fail as moral tales. They're interventions almost in your mind, in your life, that are trying to make you say, look, have you got the eyes to see? Have you got the ears to hear? Anyway, look, there's a bit of a blurb from me, but I think this matters somehow.
I love it. I want to respond to all 7 of those interesting remarks that you made, but I mean, maybe just the simplest thing to do. I honestly think Lewis would be very happy to be the John the Baptist with respect to Owen Barfield. He loved Barfield so much, and I think, And well, I mean, here's an easy place to go. Your listeners having reread your book, then just go to Lewis's introductory chapter of English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. And the title is called New Learning and New Ignorance. And I think it's basically, the Barfield, with less calories version of what Barfield himself was trying to do, except, I mean, Lewis's genius is that Barfield's difficulties, he's so abstract. And you just want to, every now and then he tosses you this precious concrete example. Reading along in Saving the Appearances, every now and then Barfield will mention something like Thomas Hardy's Peasants as an example of the last instance of this original participation. And when you find Barfield doing that, you just want to hug him and say, could you please give us a concrete illustration of every one of those very interesting abstract points you make? And I think that's Lewis's particular talent. Well, in my book, I talk about Lewis's atmosphere rendering abilities. And so I think Lewis giving these sort of concrete images is a beautiful sort of compliment to Barfield, and maybe actually a sort of entree into the more difficult abstract thinking. But New Learning and New Ignorance, I feel, is completely haunted by Barfield, as well as Book 3 of Abolition of Man, right, in which he talks about so fascinating. Lewis just anticipates so much. The types of confessions that the physicists of the Los Alamos project were making after they had invented the atomic bomb were some of the kinds of things that Lewis was uttering almost around the exact same time in Book 3 of Abolition of Man. But talking about how science, as physicists have known sin, right? Physicists have known primal sin, Oppenheimer said. But Lewis sort of talks about that as well, is that there's this sort of moment in the scientific revolution in which the scientists sort of willfully turned a blind eye to all of the reality, all of that light we cannot see is a modern novel, right? But to all of that reality which doesn't fit into their grid, doesn't fit into their methodology. And there's an original sort of pained moment in which they recognize the moral impudence, the moral impiety of ignoring such superabundance of reality, and they do it nevertheless. So there was this sort of primal moment, but of course, as that goes on and on and on, sort of the conditions of forgetfulness, sink in. In contemporary sort of philosophy of science, one of my heroes is Bas van Fraassen, who just says this in a beautiful sort of formula. He says, this is when methodological naturalism becomes ontological naturalism, by which he means there's a generation of Newtons and Boyles and maybe Galileo, even though he's kind of a questionable figure, but certainly Kepler's, who think of their experiments and their mathematical summaries as vehicles for talking about reality, but they do not think that they're exhausting all there is to say about it, right? And then so they adopt this restricted vocabulary, this restricted method to explore the natural world so that ultimately they'll be able to say more about it. Whereas our contemporaries, maybe sometime late 19th century, early 20th century, that's where Lewis puts that great divide, right? Have in some sense lived under the conditions of naturalism so long and it's been so successful in explaining external realities and trajectories of projectiles and all kinds of other, kinds of elemental compositions, that we forgot that there was once upon a time in which we intentionally bracketed certain types of discussions. And thus methodological naturalism becomes ontological naturalism, in which we just think, well, if there's something beyond this grid that we've chosen to apply it to, it's going to have to show itself. But in some sense, we've already made the fatal mistake of limiting what we even consider a valid answer in the first place. And thus, as Lewis wonderfully puts it in Surprised by Joy, as an atheist, I was angry that God didn't exist. In some sense, I both have come to the table and asked God to prove himself in ways that he doesn't speak, and been angry at him for not doing so. And so I think, yes, the fullness of of Christianity, and I think you sort of hint at it in some of your writings, but also the fullness of other these wisdom traditions, I think can safeguard what we've jokingly called the weirdness of Christianity, right? Or just, I guess we could call it the non-anthropomorphic aspects of Christianity, the non-anthropocentric aspects of Christianity, in which human beings are on the periphery of reality and are thus lovingly invited in toward the center. But they're supposed to wear their wedding garments, which we have fun ontological interpretations of that, right? They're supposed to wear their wedding garments. That is not to be so presumptuous that the wedding feast was exclusively for them. I think we could cast this in a kind of fun spiritual parable in which the wedding garments, we can summon our friends Owen and Jack, right, through their writings. But the wedding garments, in some sense, I think is this kind of like intellectual chastity, this kind of spiritual, this spiritual prudence, which takes delight in what Nicholas of Cusa, the medieval theologian, called learned ignorance.
Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, it makes me think about Barfield's reflection, say, on the word pneuma, the Greek that can be translated wind, breath, or spirit. And Barfield makes the obvious point, but that can take you a hell of a long way. That, of course, it wasn't translated as wind, breath, or spirit when the word pneuma was used. It was all of those things. And that is part of the challenge, I think, to know how, in a way, we're part of this world, invited to wear the wedding garments, as you put it so well there, in terms of maybe, we breathe, but spirit and wind, to which breath is connected, are other manifestations of this one pneuma. And so how our imaginations and our sense of our being can reach out of just our own experience of breath to be connected once more with spirit and wind in the pneuma might be one way of just trying to nudge towards what you're pointing towards there in Lewis. That makes some sense.
Yeah, and again, just going back to dear old Barfield, right? If every time he made one of those wonderful kind of abstract categories, like an original participation, if he could just give 6 or 7 examples, and I know in some sense your book means to kind of, put some meat on those bones. But I mean, one of my favorite examples, I think, and this is a modern writer trying to recreate a kind of original participation, but a medieval sensibility, is Sigurd Undset. And at the beginning of that novel, right, Kristen wanders off and sees a fairy who tries to enchant her to come and to basically leave behind her family. And then at the last second, she breaks the spell. She runs back to her father, tells her father about it. Now, I just remember the first time I was reading this, I thought, oh, I know how Dad's going to answer here. He's going to wake up and say, oh, are you playing a game? Did you see a fairy? Where is the fairy? But in Undset's imagination, the father, of course, grabs Chris and says, come with me. How close? You were so close. And then I think she must have had a great time writing that passage, in which she sort of dragged all of her empiricist modern readers along to the point where the wise scientific adult was about to dismiss the childish mythological imagination of the infant, but then shatters those expectations in order to create this portrait of the porousness. I mean, maybe that could be one of these kind of wonderful synonyms for original participation, right? But the porousness between the enchanted external world and the enchanted interior reality, and that those things sort of, flow back and forth in a manner analogous to your pneuma.
I do agree that I can read Barfield and long for examples, his own experience of what he writes about very often, and the ones that come, you sort of hold on to them and try and develop them. In your book, there are a couple of moments where I wondered about whether you were nudging towards what Barfield also called final participation, so the kind of renewed porousness, the renewed sharing with the one life of all things.
Yes.
And the two that came to my mind, well, one was when you were talking about reason and myth and how Lewis understood these to be connected. And in particular, it made me think of these tremendous images that are coming now from the James Webb telescope of the deep cosmos, and how the scientists use their imagination combined with their knowledge of what the telescope is just sending down as abstract data, to create these beautiful images, colored images, that are at once sort of awesome and sort of almost too much to grasp. And whether Lewis would say, look, just go the next step and learn once more to hear the music of the spheres.
That's right.
That these images, as he puts it, are transpositions of a reality that gives birth to the cosmos, but reaches way beyond, as well as deeply within the image that you're looking at. That makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's what my chapter about myth and science, ancient myth and modern science, is all about, is basically, yes, I think Lewis sketching this direction for science and humanities together. And I think it's deeply Barfieldian. And again, just sort of picking up on some of those wonderful hints in book 3, he says science will have to have something very close to repentance and confession, right? But then, we'll need our scientists to be versed in deeply humanistic things. And then we'll need our humanists to, not just to take an amateurish interest in the scientific and the mathematical, but to actually be able to do these things. But Lewis does say that the modern physicist is close to the medieval mystic as you can get. And so I think, I don't know when this time will come in Lewis's imagination, a couple centuries down the road, maybe. I mean, can we hope for our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation? But I think that could be sort of an exciting educational vision, is creating the conditions for those types of students in which this sort of, deeply historical, deeply reverent, deeply past focused language learning student, kind of like, the education of a John Milton, gets a contemporary STEM education, this future looking type, and then put in a position to read the world iconically again, cosmologically again, to hear the music. But as it turns out, the music is more complicated than we had previously imagined, and isn't exactly how we want that. It's more like Mahler than Palestrina, right? The music of the cosmos, and it's not 5 harmonic lines. It's a symphony for 1,000 voices, or a symphony for 1,000,000 voices. So yeah, I was very much thinking of those things, and I think Lewis thought in some ways his very humble contribution would be just carrying a candle to shed light on the beauty of these past models. That is, the sensibility that in its physicality and temporality, the invisible, the eternal, was trying to make some type of mode of expression without exhausting itself, given the limitations of physical reality. And yet that very idea, if you could update that with contemporary endeavors, could serve as a paradigm for how our science, our literature, our history, our sort of deeply steeped biblical mind could once again engage with this world. And then we'd have a new medieval, which would have, we would hope, all of the benefits of modernity, which are real, right? The sense of sort of my own kind of interior depth, our own. I think another gift that modernity gives the world is my own sense of interpersonal relationships, right? What Buber called the I-you relationship, right? That it's qualitatively a different thing. Those are gifts to the world. And so I think that's what I love about Lewis, is that analogous to Barfield, right? Who always said, look, we have to go through modernity, not back from. You want to bring the gifts of modernity and put it in dialogue with the gifts of antiquity, and perhaps some way, somehow, we'll have this new thing, this final participation emerging, in which we'll have recovered ritual, but we won't have lost our hard-won individuality.
Yeah, I'm glad you said Mahler, not Wagner, by the way, then, because I agree with you.
Good.
No, but you're right. It's and this is where Barfield, I think, had a really crucial piece to add, which is that the alienation of modernity has a role to play, which is to take us into final participation, as he puts it, not just a return to the past, but it's a step into the future that's inspired by the past in our struggles and in the pain of that. In fact, that's a different kind of redemption.
Yes.
but can I ask you too, whether there's a weirder intimation of what might be coming down the line, which you just
Oh
touch
boy,
on almost in
weirder,
passing in your
weirder
book?
still. Okay, yes,
Well, it's when you're discussing Lewis's take on the resurrection, because you
yes.
make a comment, and forgive me if I get it a bit wrong, you can correct me, that Lewis didn't regard the resurrection as a kind of miracle proof of our security, to be found in Christ, which is really, I think, a very common way of understanding the resurrection now, which leaves Christianity into a kind of fideism, I think. Like, we don't know what's going to happen, we don't understand, but we just got to cling on to this thing that we can sort of prove, we hope, happens, the resurrection, and just keep hold on to that in a kind of fideistic move. I think you were saying that Lewis didn't think of it like that at all. He saw it as an invitation, maybe that's even the word you use now, it's come back to me, to live in the world in a completely new way. And then here's the weird bit, at least to some,
Yes,
that
yeah,
maybe even what we now think of as the paranormal,
yes.
these experiences that perhaps many have actually, but it's harder to talk about,
Whoa.
ranging perhaps from synchronicities, coincidences, through experiences like seeming telepathy, and then maybe even the very strange experiences that just seem kind of odd, when matter moves and we just don't understand what's going on. But that is part of a renewed understanding of what we think of as these two separate things, the material world and the spiritual world. The resurrection, with the strange accounts of the resurrection, actually, which are of course in the New Testament, and they don't
Yeah.
really add up in a dualist frame at all.
Earthquakes, ghosts
Yeah,
wandering
yeah, and
around
walking through walls
prophesying,
one
and
minute, eating the
yeah,
next, whatever.
tails being ripped. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but this is to nudge us towards a new
Yeah.
perception of things, which again is the kingdom of heaven coming. Lewis was onto that, you're suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think wouldn't you have loved to have been Lewis's friend? Wouldn't you have loved to gone to how many of us, wouldn't have loved that, but to have gone to the bird and the baby, buy him as many drinks as he requires, and then just say, the second half of your book on miracles was really strange. What do you actually believe about this? All right, you're not on national radio right now. You're not presenting your mere Christianity, face. You're not publishing words, but tell me what you were talking about. Because I think he's very modest. I think he sort of, feels the responsibility of being a public Christian very strongly. He doesn't want to scandalize people, right? He doesn't want to scandalize, the fundamentalist, because at least they have faith, at least they believe in a God, at least they believe in Jesus Christ, true God, true man. And so in the end, they'll be fine, right? They might have a lot of, back learning to do once they've gotten into a situation of eternity, right? So I think Lewis feels that public responsibility of being very modest publicly, very strongly. But he does say some incredible things. And what I say in the book is that it lets you know that when he's talking sci-fi, he doesn't believe that this is this sort of like bizarre, strange, paranormal thing, but is actually very close to what could be reality. What he says is, as your readers or your listeners will remember, Lewis's readers, is that in miracles, that the resurrection was not just, this great proof, as you mentioned, but it was the first type of a new miracle. And some says it was a great reset. It was going to be a new way in which Christians would actually participate with nature. And it was almost kind of an aborted project, which, maybe would have happened. Maybe the apostles give us some sort of example of this. Maybe these weren't miracles, right? But these were just sort of like purified minds interacting in the natural world and the new sort of paradigm that Christ establishes, right? But somehow, some way, and again, you wish that Lewis would provide you with the details over a pint, right? Somehow, some way, this whole project gets derailed, right? We become too interested in the magical / scientific manipulation and control of reality, in which case we get sort of, this is very Barfieldian, isn't it? We get sort of divorced from the natural reality. And that's that, this great experiment of this new type of post-resurrection relationship to God's creation is kind of messed up. And we're actually, severely spiritually emaciated people, a bunch of badly hurt, wounded, souls who hardly even know it. right? But so I think Lewis kind of gets close to it, but then backs off. And then I think what he would probably say to us is, well, that's where Christianity is different from Platonism. And that's where Christianity is different from the sacred wisdom traditions, all of which I admire, I half admire. I think they're 33% correct, right? Or, some are 17% correct, right? But in the end, Christians believe in an eschaton, right? We believe in an eschatological end of times reality in which we're going to have to pass through think last battle, some type of portal and enter into a new domain. But when we do, we might actually live out in our enfleshed, incarnate, embodied beings, something analogous to what Jesus gives us a brief glimpse of, and maybe his apostles do too, right? Walking by and my shadow is healing, is healing the crippled, right? That maybe that's somehow some way to come. Now, if that is indeed somehow some way to come, and it's some type of temporal reality, but set in a new, more perfect world, then here's the great thing. Then all the myths, everything you find in Ovid is not scientifically untrue. It's just projected to a temporal spatial reality, which we haven't yet got to. And I think that's what Lewis loved, is that kind of that psychological instinct, that sort of Jungian instinct to trust that our ancestors weren't cavemen, right? Lewis jokes about that, right? A lot of our contemporaries think that people living in antiquity were, hitting wheels with stones and pulling each other by the hair and hitting each other with clubs, right? But that our ancestors in that type of mythological instinct were actually in tune with something, which is true, just not yet. It's sort of projected for this future reality. So I think Lewis might go about saying something like that, and then at least we get one sort of crucial distinction for those of you who mentioned, for that audience is concerned about the conflation of Christianity and Platonism. That would be at least one really important kind of firewall of, well, Christianity has an eschatological reality. So long as I'm just on the subject, if you don't mind me mentioning it, I think the other important sort of firewall is that Christianity believes in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, right? And that Platonism does not. Platonism believes that the higher I ascend in my mind, the sort of lower into my soul I descend, right? And thus, I kind of don't need Jesus in a way, or Jesus becomes merely a paradigm. Whereas I think there's this something kind of neat in Lewis, kind of humble, kind of childlike, of that his characters, especially in the Narnia stories, continue to fail, and that they have lofty spiritual ambitions which they can't entirely enact, and they need to be brushed by the whiskers of Aslan. And they're always surprised by Aslan in his particularity. That in some sense their lofty spiritual ambitions can't be fully enacted by them, but they need Christ in his particularity, in his historical proximity to me, in my individuality and in my brokenness. I think that's just some classic Augustine right there, right? What's the difference between the pagans and the Christians? Well, the pagans climb the mountain and see the blessed isle at a distance. The Christians, in imitation of their Lord who descended, go down that mountain and go through all the brambles which rip and cut their legs, and in a descent of humility, in the particularity of their enfleshed body, imitate their Lord. And thus, this sort of aspect of incarnation, descent, humility, this kind of bundled thing, which I have to regretfully embrace the failure of my temporal reality and my need of a particular Jesus Christ. That, I think, that can map onto this whole kind of Platonic vision of remembrance, but also sort of protects it from that direction which Lewis felt Platonism could sort of evaporate into, of Gnosticism.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And just to put it simply, if this is simple, but the experience, not just not even in the sort of theurgic strand of Platonism, where this world really does matter because it is radiant with the one. But even there, Christianity, I think, has this extra element, which is that the one is coming for us, if you like.
Yes, that's
to
right.
cross
I love it.
languages, and so we're
Yes.
called and
Yes.
found, as much as finding and searching.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in my
And
little book on Christian mysticism, that's, I mean, I want to try to develop something like what you just, I think, said so intuitively, Mark, that the one comes looking for us. And I just love to add that passage, right? And the one comes and waits in the hot afternoon to talk to some random unimportant woman who's on to her, what, fifth or sixth marriage by a well. That's its level of particularity, right? To descend to that, to you and your own heartbroken, particularized miseries. I mean, that's incredible. And I think, but in some sense, I think we're in the funny situation in which we don't care about the incarnation of Jesus anymore because we've lost a vision of the numinousness of the one. And so thus, I think our kind of historical mission is recovering deep Christianity, right? What we've jokingly called earlier, the weirdness of the ancient forms of Christianity. And when we do that, then I think in some sense, the scandal of the incarnation, like we're no longer scandalized by it, right? The scandal, the stumbling block of the incarnation will once again present itself to us in all of its difficulty. But we have to recover the background of the kind of the incredible cosmic story.
yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I got onto Barfield was because of his understanding of the incarnation, which, as a kind of a born and raised Christian who's kind of moved around a bit and finding a way back towards the heart of things rather than trying to accommodate myself to multiple manifestations of Christianity, have a heartfelt commitment. That's really what I'm saying. But Barfield really helped me with that because of his understanding of the incarnation, which has this evolutionary component, so that Christ comes at a turning point in the human history, and it's connected to individuality, which you mentioned, that there was this kind of gathering together of the sense of what it was to be a human. And whilst that led to an alienation from the natural world, it also led to the capacity to perceive the unity, the oneness of the cosmos in the divine, that our individuality could reflect the divine unity. And hence monotheism and human individuality are deeply intertwined in terms of our perception of the one God. And I feel that whilst I do take the point about Christianity and the Eschaton sort of coming, I feel like we must also remember that it can come now as well as at some point in the future. And I'm more inclined to not worry so much about the coming in the future, and try and understand how it might be, and more importantly, actually, like, look out, listen for moments when it's actually coming now, and maybe imaginatively at first, and then gradually that can become more of a felt reality now, aligning myself to that. And I think this is, deep, way back in the Christian church. When I think of someone like Paul saying how when he prays deeply, he realizes the Spirit is already praying within him, that meeting point of the human and divine. The more that we can understand the incarnation in that way, the more I think that we'll know of this eschatological vision, even in the here and now.
I love that. And I think that we've kind of, dare I say, accidentally probably recreated something very analogous to a discussion in The Eagle and the Child, and maybe even sort of like lines of division between Barfield and between Lewis. And I think, I have that chapter on Lewis's mysticism and how how temperate Lewis felt he had to be with it. My suspicion is that Lewis would tell his dear buddy Owen, "I love it," but that would replace the virtue of hope, right? This is for the other side of the door. And I think Owen would say, "Do you think that the incarnation is a one-time phenomenon? Rather, have you forgotten Pentecost, Jack? Right? That these things, right? That these things are meant to happen in order for us to continue the sort. We get the privilege of sort of participating in the incarnation, right? And that there would be a sort of a more emphasis on the here and now. And so I don't know. Maybe this is a mealy solution, but I think I want to do what you talk about, and sort of doing the best we can to well, let's put it this way. Lewis says that our lives are punctuated, rare punctuation marks by this eruption of joy. And that the goal, in some sense, of the spiritual life, but also the aesthetic life, the moral life, is to not only have those punctuation marks come more frequently, but to the extent we can, if we could extend them, so that we might actually begin slowly to sort of live ever more fully in that state of what he calls joy. And it seems to me that that's something like what you're saying, Mark. And then if Jack were here, he would just want to add one last thing. Okay, you're making me a little bit nervous. As long as you don't forget your Monday morning duties, you can have your Sabbath rest. That's what he says at the end of The Weight of Glory, right? As long as you don't forget to care for widows and orphans and the broken pieces of humanity in their particularity, as long as you don't forget to do your ordinary boring chores, and as long as you don't forget to not have, disdain for that person in the squeaky boots who sings poorly in that pew over there, right? As long as you don't get too spiritual that you're too good to be religious, I think Jack would say, I'll let you do it. Right. I think but my feeling is that in some sense that kind of here and now versus eschatological hope, what I call in my book nostalgia for the future, is probably one of the very tensions between these two friends who both admire each other and are half persuaded by each other, and yet have their own kind of, gravitational directions.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice because it was acted out in their friendship in the way that Barfield looked after Lewis's financial affairs, which included managing the money that was donated to the widows and the orphans from Lewis's, substantial earnings. So that was, really was going on in their lives as much as their sort of yearnings and visionary hopes. I just related there as well. I was really pleased and loved in your book that when you're talking about Dante, you draw attention to, the weight of glory is the expression, perhaps, how Dante, the spiritual doesn't float off and become thinner and thinner and lighter in the paradise.
Right.
It becomes more and more substantial.
Yes.
And the images from the natural world, for
Yes.
example, of mountains as much as beautiful flowers, are absolutely crucial. And Lewis saw this.
Yes.
And you draw attention to that. I was delighted that you did that because, as having written about the Divine Comedy as well, such a big frustration of mine is how people get obsessed with the Inferno. They kind of drift around the Purgatorio a bit, but the Paradiso, they say, doesn't make much sense to them at all. And maybe that's partly because the spirituals become too ethereal. And we can read Dante again through Lewis and realize, no, he's saying that paradise is really here and now, if only we can learn how to see it. Dante's writing for our times. He's not the summation of some great medieval vision. I think he knew that was beginning to come undone. He was writing for our times to say we can see these things in the substantial, in fact.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah, exactly. And just thinking that the examination scene of Paradiso 24, 25, and 26, where Dante encounters James, who's examining him on, is a theme of our conversation today, on the virtue of hope. And Dante uses that quick little metaphor of not just mountains, but mountains that rise precipitously at a very steep angle. And I've only seen this a couple of times, but a couple of times actually in Italy. I went to the monastery that Dante mentions of Peter Damian, and saw what made me think, oh wow, this is the natural experience that Dante must have had with this precipitous rise of the mountains. Because when they rise precipitously, it creates a sense of crushing weight, in which you feel the weightiness of it. So in my mind, Lewis, who loved that particular metaphor, and says any ordinary assertion of their holiness wouldn't have done better than this metaphor, which brings a sense of crushing weight, right? Holiness is being at the bottom of the ocean, right? Feeling the sort of, the pressure of glory. That when he went back to the Pauline passage of this present lightness, right, that fails to compare to the weight of glory, in some sense, he used Dante to gloss scripture. And thus in his own kind of meditation, it's kind of, the scriptural, the Judaic and the long Greco-Roman tradition sort of recombining in Lewis's mind. But absolutely, right? I mean, that's in his transposition. Lewis talks about how the difficulty that the higher level language has in getting into the lower level language. And we've already talked about Mahler, right? But trying to take a Mahler symphony and transposing it for the piano. If you've heard the Mahler symphony, you play the piano, you can remember the wonderful, rich array of instruments, notes, and voices in the original. But we don't oftentimes think about that as being an analogy of proportions for the visible world, as if it were a piano keyboard, with respect to the invisible world, which is the Mahler symphony. Rather, we kind of go the other way around, right? We think that this world of delicious senses and pleasures and time must surely be infinitely more varied and richly arrayed than the eternal. And thus, for Lewis, and now for you too, Mark, Dante is not just the summation of what was come, but in some sense, he's a special messenger to us who have this sallow, sickly image of heaven, as I like to jokingly say. It's nothing but angels strumming lutes, wearing freshly laundered, bed sheets, right?
Yeah,
Who wants to
I
go
mean,
there? Right?
yeah. I mean, just one more thought, and then perhaps we'll draw things to a close. But I think another element which is really crucial is the old imperative to know thyself. And I think this comes out in the Paradiso, and Lewis is onto it as well. When the strange thing happens to Dante, when after the heaven of Mercury, he doesn't see any of the soul's faces until I think when he has the conversation with John, actually, after James, when they speak about love, and suddenly he sees faces again. And I've interpreted this as saying that Dante must learn that he can only fully secure the paradisal vision when he fully understands his participation in the paradisal vision. And so he must know himself in order to know others, and know how altogether in the harmony of that appears in the heaven of Jupiter, particularly the I and the we and the you and singular and plural kind of come together. And so that's another part, I think, of this future that's now is remembering who we are. I mean, Lewis has his novel, of course, Till They Have Faces, which I guess must be picking up on this. But that's another facet, perhaps, of this anticipation of what's here already, but also strangely to come.
Yeah, I like that read. And as I sometimes say to my students, in Dante's Paradiso, there's no such thing as a parasite. Is that you can't just go with the expectation of soaking in joy, right? You can't bring your empty bucket. You actually have to be a contributor. In some sense, you have to bring the own kind of richness of your own interior life. You have to have joy to share. And when you do, you'll have other people sharing theirs with you, but you have to arrive. And in my mind, one of the ways to read this examination scene is that they're funny little questions, and Dante keeps nailing the correct scholastic definitions right off the bat. He knows his scholastic theology, but then the apostles keep poking him. They want more than the correct answer. And my read of this is that in heaven, those who pass the test have to become poets, in the sense that they don't have just sort of correct head doctrines and correct opinions, but they have the ability to make the people around them desire it. This is what the love poet does, right? And I think our two ways of talking about this actually map perfectly on each other. And this just confirms in me what I told you before we started recording, that clearly we're twins separated at birth, who were forced to grow up on either side of the Atlantic, but now our interests have reunited us in the Inklings and the medieval thought.
Thank you for that. I'm flattered and delighted by that. And look, let's finish, because what you just said there about how we must, to use the Barfieldian word, become participants, means we must be able to sing in order to inspire the angels singing of these things, which is another way of putting it, and what happens to Dante in Paradise. And not be just parasites. That links back actually in my mind to where we started really, which is about a Christianity that's not just credal, that's not just moral, but that is actually good news. It's joyous. And so let me just recommend your book, because it's very much helped me to want to sing that music once more. The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. Give it a read, and maybe it will do something like it did to me, which is to spark a fresh yearning, but also a filled heart with these things that Lewis, and of course Barfield and Dante and Boethius and the others were onto. And we pray that we'll be able to be part of that coming down, as well as springing up a renewed medieval minds for the 21st century, put it like that.
Sounds good.
Thanks very much, Jason. And that's a long way of saying thanks very much for talking. I've really appreciated it.
Thanks. It's been a delight. Thank you.